My name is Matthew Whitaker. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my life, I've been described the same way: steady, reliable, quiet. I work as a data analyst for a healthcare nonprofit in Portland, the kind of job where details matter and mistakes cost more than money. I've always been comfortable behind the scenes, the person who notices patterns others overlook, the one who listens more than he speaks. People tend to underestimate me, not in a dramatic way, not cruelly, just casually. I'm the son who never argued, the brother who didn't compete, the one who didn't demand attention at family dinners. If there was a spotlight in the room, it belonged to someone else, and I never tried to take it. But this isn't a story about being shy, and it's not a story about revenge. It's about a document, a government-issued family registry. And the day I saw my name wasn't on it, the day I learned I was adopted, after seeing my name missing from the family registry, no one planned to tell me. There wasn't a dramatic confession, no trembling voices, no sudden revelations, just a quiet administrative errand that turned into a quiet unraveling. At first, I thought it was a clerical error. Then I thought it was temporary. Then I realized something much heavier. It wasn't a mistake. It was an omission. An omission, when it lasts decades, becomes its own kind of truth. What followed wasn't shouting. There were no slammed doors, no cinematic confrontations in the rain. Instead, there were patterns I began to see clearly for the first time. Small moments from childhood that rearranged themselves into something coherent. Comments that once felt harmless suddenly felt deliberate. Silences that now made sense. This story isn't about exposing anyone. It's about understanding what happens when identity shifts quietly, when the foundation you stood on your entire life turns out to be borrowed ground. I won't tell this with anger, and I won't exaggerate pain to make it entertaining. I'll tell it the way I lived it, slowly, carefully, honestly, because sometimes the most life-changing truths don't arrive with noise. They arrive with paperwork. And sometimes the deepest question isn't why didn't they tell me? It's this: if you found out your place in your own family was conditional all along, what would you do with that knowledge? In my family, I was the calm one. That was the label. It sounded like praise. It felt like positioning. My older brother, Daniel, was the achiever. Athletic, loud, magnetic. The kind of person teachers remembered years later. My younger sister, Emily, was the sensitive one. Artistic. Emotional. The one who needed protection. And me? I was easy. If relatives visited, they'd say things like, "Matthew's always been so low maintenance." At school events, my parents would tell teachers, "He doesn't cause any trouble." At holidays, I was the one asked to help set the table, clear the plates, and drive grandma home. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't harsh. It was just consistent. I learned early that my value came from being dependable, from not complicating things, from understanding what needed to be done without being told. If Daniel forgot something, it was brushed off. That's just how he is. If Emily had an emotional outburst, it was met with comfort. She feels things deeply. If I ever showed frustration, the reaction was different. "You're the mature one, Matt. Don't start." It wasn't said angrily, just matter of fact, like reminding someone of their assigned seat. So I adjusted. I stopped competing. I stopped correcting. I stopped expecting recognition. There's a subtle shift that happens when a child realizes praise is conditional. Not conditional on achievement, but on compliance. When I was 12, I won a regional math competition. I remember holding the certificate on the car ride home. My father nodded. "Good job, son." My mother smiled in the rearview mirror. But that same evening, dinner conversation revolved around Daniel's upcoming soccer championship. Logistics, strategy, excitement. My certificate stayed folded in my backpack. Again, not cruelty, just prioritization. And patterns, when repeated long enough, become identity. I became the observer. At family gatherings, I'd watch how conversations formed around certain people, how jokes landed differently depending on who told them, how decisions were made before I entered the room. There was a rhythm to it. Daniel initiated, Emily reacted, my parents mediated. I supported, I was included, but never central. Present, but rarely consulted. Even practical things followed that structure. When it was time to discuss college plans, my brother had family meetings, pros and cons lists. Campus visits are planned months ahead. For me, the assumption was simpler. Matthew will figure it out. He always does. And I did. I applied. I researched scholarships. I filled out paperwork alone at the kitchen table. Not because anyone told me to, but because no one hovered. I used to think that independence was a compliment. Now I understand it was distance disguised as trust. There's a difference. Growing up, I didn't feel unloved. That's important. There were birthdays. There were hugs. There were photos on the living room wall with all three of us smiling in coordinated holiday sweaters. But love has layers. There's affectionate love, there's proud love, and then there's protective, instinctive love. The kind that feels territorial, fierce. I saw that kind of directed at my siblings. With me, it was measured, reasonable. As a child, you don't question measured love. You adapt to it. You become what keeps it steady. So I became the son who didn't need much, or at least the son who learned not to ask. Looking back now, I can see how useful that role was for everyone else. Reliable, useful, invisible when necessary. And the thing about invisibility, you don't realize how complete it is until you look for proof that you were officially there. And your name isn't listed. The first time something didn't sit right with me, I was 16. It wasn't dramatic. No shouting, no slammed doors. It was paperwork. My high school required certified copies of birth certificates for a state academic program I'd qualified for. Most students handed them in casually, folded into backpacks. I mentioned it at dinner one night. "I need a certified copy of my birth certificate by Friday," I said, reaching for the salt. My mother paused for half a second. It was subtle. If you weren't watching her face closely, you wouldn't have noticed. "Oh," she said, "I'll have to look for it." Daniel, sitting across from me, laughed. "You don't even know where your own documents are?" It was a joke. Everyone smiled. But my father added, "We might need to request a new copy. It's probably archived somewhere." Archived. The word lingered in my head. I didn't think much of it at the time. Families lose documents. Things get misplaced. But the next few days were strange. Whenever I asked if they'd found it, the answers were vague. "Still looking. We'll handle it. Don't worry about it." By Wednesday evening, my mother handed me a sealed envelope. "Here," she said, "this should work." I didn't open it at home. I assumed it was routine. The next day in the school office, I tore it open while standing in line. The paper inside looked official enough. Stamped, embossed. My name was there, my date of birth, the hospital. But something felt sterile. There were no signatures from my parents on the hospital record section. No attending physician was listed in the space where others had scribbled ink names. Just typed text. "Everything okay?" the secretary asked. "Yeah," I said quickly, sliding it across the counter. She barely glanced at it before stamping my application as complete. That should have been the end of it. But later that evening, I walked past the living room and overheard something. My parents' voices were low, controlled. "He didn't ask any questions," my father said. "No," my mother replied. "He never does." They weren't angry. They weren't panicked. Just relieved. I stepped into the hallway loudly so they'd know I was there. The conversation stopped immediately. "Matt," my mother called out with practiced brightness, "did everything go through okay at school?" "Yeah," I answered. "Good," she said. "We didn't want any complications." Complications. Again, an unusual word for something as simple as a birth certificate. I remember lying in a bed that night, staring at the ceiling. My mind tried to rationalize it. Maybe they'd lost the original. Maybe it was normal to request a reissued copy. Maybe I was overthinking it. That was always my instinct, to smooth over discomfort before it could become conflict. But something small had shifted. Not a crack. Not yet. Just a thin line you only notice when light hits it a certain way. Over the next few months, I paid closer attention. Not confrontationally, quietly. I noticed how quickly certain topics were redirected when I entered the room. How my baby photos were fewer than Daniel's and Emily's in the hallway collage. How relatives would sometimes hesitate, just briefly, before saying, "You look so different from your siblings." Different how? No one elaborated. And I didn't push. Because in my family, pushing created inconvenience. And I had spent my entire life avoiding being inconvenient. Still, that small cut stayed with me. It didn't bleed, but it didn't close either. After that moment, I didn't become suspicious. I became observant. There's a difference. Suspicion is loud. It demands answers. Observation is quiet. It collects them. Through the rest of high school and into college, I started noticing small dismissals that I had previously categorized as normal family dynamics. For example, medical history. In freshman year, we had to complete a detailed family health questionnaire. Heart disease, genetic conditions, and a cancer history. I called home to ask for specifics. My mother hesitated again. "Just put down what we've told you before," she said. "I don't remember specifics," I replied. "Was it Grandpa who had hypertension or Uncle Mark?" There was a pause long enough for me to hear the refrigerator humming in the background. "Matthew," she said carefully, "you don't need to overcomplicate it. It's just a form." Just a form. That phrase again. When Daniel filled out similar paperwork for a sports physical, I remember my father sitting with him at the kitchen table, recounting extended relatives' diagnoses in detail. Dates, ages, even treatment plans. With me, it was minimized. At the time, I explained it away. Daniel was an athlete. Maybe it mattered more. Maybe they were busy when I called. Maybe I really was overcomplicating things. That became my pattern: reinterpret, rationalize, reduce. Then there were jokes. At a cousin's wedding when I was 22, an aunt I rarely saw hugged me and said, "You always seemed like the outlier." She laughed lightly, as if it were affectionate. "Outlier how?" I asked. "Oh, you know," she waved vaguely. "Different temperament, different look, but in a good way." Different look. I'd heard that before. My siblings both had dark brown hair and olive undertones. I was lighter. Gray eyes, sharper features. Growing up, it had been framed as genetic randomness. Recessive genes, my mother would say with a smile. Science as explanation. Science as shield. At that wedding, I watched family members cluster into conversational orbits. There were invisible gravitational pulls I couldn't quite feel. No one excluded me outright. No one told me I didn't belong. But belonging has texture. It's in the way people reference shared memories without explaining them. It's in the shorthand language of inside jokes. It's in the instinctive way parents defend one child over another without thinking. I saw those things happen around me, rarely toward me, and every time I noticed, I adjusted internally. Maybe I was just more independent. Maybe I projected the distance. Maybe this was my personality shaping perception. That was the most comfortable explanation, that I was the variable. Because if I wasn't the variable, then something structural was, and structural problems are harder to ignore. By my mid-20s, I had become extremely self-sufficient. I handled my own taxes. I secured my own apartment. I navigated career shifts without asking for advice. My parents praised that. "You've always been so capable, Matt." Capable. The word sounded like admiration, but capability can also be a convenient reason not to invest. When Emily went through a difficult breakup, my mother flew across the country to stay with her for a week. When I ended a 3-year relationship around the same time, my father texted, "You'll land on your feet." He meant well. He always meant well, and I always told myself that intention was what mattered. Over time, these small imbalances stopped feeling sharp. They became background noise. I normalized them, explained them, filed them away in the same mental cabinet as the birth certificate envelope and the whispered complications. Nothing was dramatic enough to confront. Nothing was blatant enough to accuse. But when you grow up adjusting your expectations downward, something subtle happens. You stop asking whether you're being treated differently, and start asking whether you deserve to be. That question sat quietly in me for years, until the day a government registry forced it into the light. By the time I was 30, the role was fully formed. Not written down, not spoken aloud, but understood. In every family system, whether people admit it or not, roles stabilize the structure. There's the golden child, the fragile one, the rebel, the fixer. I was the stabilizer. The son who would show up early to Thanksgiving and stay late to wash dishes. The one who drove my parents to medical appointments when Daniel was too swamped and Emily was emotionally overwhelmed. The one who read the fine print on insurance policies and explained it calmly at the kitchen table. If something required patience, it was handed to me. If something required emotional labor without recognition, it found me. And I accepted it, not resentfully, almost automatically. There's a strange reward system attached to being dependable. People trust you with responsibility, but not vulnerability. They lean on you, but don't always lean towards you. I became the family's quiet infrastructure. When my father considered refinancing the house, he asked me to review the loan documents. "Just give it a once-over," he said. "You're good with this kind of thing." I spent 2 evenings analyzing interest structures and long-term cost projections. I printed out notes, highlighted clauses. He thanked me, then proceeded to take Daniel's advice on which lender felt more straightforward. I remember sitting there, nodding, not offended, just filed away. Later that same year, my parents updated their will. They told all 3 of us casually over dinner. "Just routine planning," my mother said. "We're getting older." Daniel immediately asked about distribution percentages. Emily asked who would manage sentimental items. I didn't ask anything, because in my head it was already clear. I would be assigned executor duties, administrative tasks, coordination, the steady hand. And I was right. A week later, my father called me privately. "We've listed you as executor," he said. "You're the most organized." Organized. Responsible. Reliable. I thanked him. I didn't ask about anything else. Not because I didn't care, but because caring in a visible way would have felt out of character. It would have disrupted the image they had of me. There's a subtle pressure to remain consistent with how people define you. If you're the calm one, you don't suddenly demand transparency. If you're the strong one, you don't suddenly need reassurance. Roles become contracts, silent ones, and I had signed mine early. Looking back, I can see how convenient that role was. I absorbed tension. When Daniel and Emily argued over holiday plans, I mediated. When my parents complained about one sibling to the other, I listened without escalating. I was in Switzerland. Neutral, stable, safe. But neutrality has a cost. When you're always the reasonable one, your own emotional reactions feel excessive, even when they're justified. So when things didn't add up, when documents felt incomplete, when stories didn't align perfectly, I told myself consistency mattered more than curiosity. My job was to keep the peace, not disturb it. My job was to be useful, not central. And here's the part I didn't realize until much later. Roles aren't just assigned, they're reinforced. Every time I handled something quietly, I confirmed their assumption that I didn't need more. Every time I swallowed a question, I trained them not to offer answers. It wasn't malicious. It was efficient. I was the son who didn't require explanation. The son who would understand. The son who wouldn't make things complicated. And if there was one word my family avoided at all costs, it was that one. Complicated. I didn't know then how deeply that word was connected to me, but I was about to find out. The shift didn't happen during an argument. It didn't happen during a holiday. It happened on a Tuesday morning in March, in a government office that smelled faintly of toner and old paper. My parents were applying for an updated family registry extract, part of a broader estate planning process. My father had asked me to come along just to make sure everything's processed correctly. Executor duties. I took a half-day off work and met them downtown. The building was municipal and unremarkable. Fluorescent lights, gray counters, a digital queue number blinking overhead. We waited quietly. My mother scrolled through her phone. My father rehearsed questions under his breath. When our number was called, we stepped up together. The clerk, a woman in her late 40s with reading glasses perched low on her nose, asked for identification and began pulling up records. "Full legal names?" she asked. My father answered. My mother confirmed. The keyboard clicked steadily. Then the clerk turned the monitor slightly toward my parents. "Here is the current registered household structure," she said. "Primary guardians, dependent history, and recorded children." I wasn't meant to look, but I did. On the screen were 3 entries under Children of Record. Daniel Whitaker, Emily Whitaker. 2 names. The line beneath them was blank. I waited for the page to scroll. It didn't. I assumed it was truncated, maybe pagination. "Is there another page?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. The clerk glanced at me briefly. "No, this is complete." Complete! My father shifted beside me. "There should be 3, he said quickly. "Our son Matthew." The clerk typed again, slower this time. "Matthew Hale Whitaker," she read aloud. "Yes, I see an individual record under that name." She clicked. The screen changed. "Registered as adopted minor, finalized July 1992. Linked through a separate adoption certificate. Not listed under the biological lineage registry." The words were clinical, unemotional. "Adopted a minor. Finalized July 1992. Not listed under the biological lineage registry." There was no dramatic sound in my ears, no rushing pulse. Just a stillness. "Oh," my mother said softly. That was it. Not shocked, no surprise. Just recognition. The clerk continued speaking, unaware she had just rearranged my life. "This is standard formatting," she explained. "Adopted children are recorded under individual identity records, but not under biological registry sections. If you'd like a consolidated extract, we can request a combined legal family summary." My father cleared his throat. "Yes, that would be fine." His tone was steady. "Practiced?" No one turned to look at me. No one said, "Matthew." No one said, "We were going to tell you." Because in that moment, I understood something without being told. No one planned to tell me. This wasn't a secret accidentally exposed. It was a truth intentionally compartmentalized. I stood there, hands resting lightly on the counter, staring at the word adopted on the screen. I searched internally for anger. It didn't come. I searched for betrayal. Not immediately. What surfaced instead was alignment, like puzzle pieces snapping into place. The medical history evasions, the birth certificate envelope, the comments about looking different, the measured love. It wasn't the absence of love. It was structured. I wasn't biologically woven into the family fabric. I had been added, chosen, technically, but not disclosed. And that distinction matters. On the drive home, no one addressed it. My father talked about parking validation. My mother asked if we should stop for coffee. I stared out the window at passing buildings, watching reflections distort across the glass. Something inside me recalibrated that day. Not violently, precisely, because once you know your origin story was edited, you stop playing the role written for you, silently, deliberately. And that was the real shift. We never talked about it. Not that day, not that week, not that month. And I didn't bring it up. That surprised even me. Most people imagine discovery like that demands confrontation. A raised voice, a trembling, "Why didn't you tell me?" But confrontation requires 2 things, shock and uncertainty. I had neither. What I had was confirmation. The registry didn't introduce a foreign truth. It validated a lifelong undercurrent. It explained the careful distance, the measured affection, the structural positioning. It gave language to something I had already been living. So I chose silence, not the silence of avoidance, the silence of observation. At Sunday dinner that week, I watched my parents more closely than I ever had. My mother asked Danielle about a promotion opportunity. She leaned forward, eyes bright, asking detailed follow-up questions. She asked Emily about a pottery class she'd joined, nodding gently as Emily described the therapeutic process of shaping clay. When she turned to me, the question was familiar. "How's work, Matt?" "Stable," I said. She smiled with relief. Stable? The safest word I could offer. I noticed something subtle in myself that evening. I wasn't hurt. I was recalculating. When you discover that your identity within a system was constructed on partial disclosure, your first instinct isn't always to tear it down. Sometimes it's to understand it fully. If I had confronted them immediately, the conversation would have become emotional, defensive, clouded. Instead, I wanted clarity. So I did what I've always done best. I gathered data. I reviewed old family photo albums when I visited. I noted the timeline. My appearance in pictures started abruptly at around 9 months old. There were no hospital photos of my birth, no images of my mother visibly pregnant with me. I replayed childhood memories through a different lens. The way relatives sometimes said, "You're so lucky to have such wonderful parents," with a slight emphasis on lucky. The way my father once corrected someone who said, "You must be proud of all 3 of your kids." "We are," he replied. "Very fortunate." Fortunate. The language had always been careful, and now I understand why. What changed most wasn't how they behaved. It was how I interpreted it. Before, when my emotional needs were minimized, I internalized it as personal resilience. Now, I saw it as risk management. You don't destabilize a structure built on quiet omission. You keep it steady, and I had been the steadiest component. Silence, for years, had been reflex. Now it has become strategic. I stopped offering emotional details voluntarily. I stopped filling conversational gaps. I stopped smoothing tension when my siblings clashed. If Daniel forgot to call our parents for 2 weeks, I didn't remind him. If Emily complained about feeling unsupported, I listened, but I didn't mediate. I didn't withdraw affection. I withdrew automatic labor, and no one noticed. That was the most instructive part. When you remove something truly essential from a system, disruption happens quickly. When I pulled back, the structure continued smoothly, which meant something difficult but clarifying. I had been useful, but not foundational. The more I observed, the more a quiet question formed. If I weren't biologically tied, if my inclusion was legal but not openly acknowledged, what else had been decided without my knowledge? And more importantly, what leverage did that give me now? Because truth, once known, isn't just emotional. It's informational. And information in the right hands is power. I wasn't angry. I was awake. Once silence became intentional, preparation followed naturally, not in a dramatic way. I didn't hire private investigators. I didn't secretly record conversations. I did what I've always done. I researched. The adoption had been finalized in July 1992. I knew that from the registry screen. That single line gave me a timestamp, and timestamps are anchors. Through public records requests and archived court documents, I learned something important within a few weeks. My adoption had been private, closed, facilitated through an agency that no longer existed under its original name. The paperwork was sealed, but not invisible. Case numbers, attorney signatures, jurisdiction codes, they were all traceable if you knew how to read them. And I did. Late at night, after work, I sat at my kitchen table with my black leather notebook open, mapping timelines. My date of birth, adoption finalization date, the gap between them, 9 months. 9 months where I existed, somewhere, before legally becoming a Whitaker. I didn't know whether to interpret that gap as a delay or deliberation, but I documented it. I also requested my original birth certificate through the proper state channels. That process required identity verification, notarized forms, and patience. Patience has never intimidated me. While I waited, I studied something else, estate law, specifically, how adoption status intersects with inheritance structures when language in a will differentiates between biological issue and lawful children. My parents' will, which I had reviewed as executor, used careful phrasing. All lawful children. That was legally inclusive. But I'd learned by then that language matters most in its precision, not its sentiment. I wasn't looking to challenge anything. I was looking to understand my position. Clarity before action. That became my internal motto. Meanwhile, at family gatherings, I maintained my role. I showed up. I helped. I smiled. But I no longer volunteered extra. When my father asked me to review another financial document, I did. But I returned it without commentary unless specifically requested. When Emily called crying about a disagreement with Daniel, I listened. But I didn't resolve it. Subtle shifts, measured withdrawals. Again, no one noticed, which confirmed something else. My value had been operational, not relational. One evening, about 3 months after the registry office, I visited my parents' house alone. My mother was in the kitchen. My father was in the study. On a shelf in the hallway sat a storage box labeled Important Documents. For years, I'd walked past it without curiosity. That night, curiosity outweighed courtesy. I didn't open it. I just noted its presence. Because here's something people misunderstand about leverage. It isn't about grabbing documents or creating scenes. It's about knowing where the fulcrum is. I began assembling my own. Copies of public records, adoption statutes from the early 1990s, agency merger histories, court procedural notes. Nothing illegal, nothing invasive, just thorough. Then finally, my original birth certificate arrived. It came in a plain envelope, no ceremony. I opened it alone. The name listed under mother was not my mother's. The hospital was in a different county than the one I'd grown up hearing about. My original surname was different. I stared at it for a long time. There was no rush of cinematic emotion, just a slow, steady reorientation. For 34 years, my identity had been built on a simplified narrative. Now I hold the extended version. And the most interesting realization wasn't about biology. It was about intention. My parents hadn't just chosen adoption. They had chosen silence. Silence for decades. Silence during medical forms. Silence during identity milestones. Silence during that registry office moment, even when disclosure would have been natural. That meant something. Not cruelty. Control. Control over timing. Control over narrative. Control over who knew what and when. But information isn't static. Once I had it, the control balanced. They didn't know what I knew. They didn't know I had my original certificate. They didn't know I understood the legal framework. They didn't know I was mapping timelines. And I didn't reveal any of it, because preparation is quiet. And quiet, when chosen deliberately, is rarely weakness. It's positioning. The real revelation didn't happen when I received my original birth certificate. It happened 2 weeks later. I had scheduled a consultation, not with a therapist, not with a private investigator, but with an estate attorney. Not to contest anything, not to accuse anyone, just to understand. I brought a copy of my parents' will, the one I'd reviewed before, along with the adoption documentation and the registry extract notes I'd written down from memory. The attorney, a woman in her early 50s with a precise way of speaking, listened without interruption. When I finished explaining, she asked one question. "Do your parents know that you know?" "No," I said. She nodded slowly. "Then what you're looking for isn't legal correction," she said. "It's leverage clarity." That phrasing stayed with me. Leverage clarity. She explained something important. Under state law, as a legally adopted child, I had equal inheritance rights unless explicitly excluded. The will's phrasing, all lawful children, was airtight. There was no vulnerability there. But she pointed out something else. In estate planning, she said, tapping the document lightly, the executor holds administrative power, not ownership, but control over timing, communication, and asset distribution processes. Control over timing. That word again. Meaning? I asked calmly. Meaning, she replied. If something were ever contested or complicated, the executor's interpretation of ambiguous phrasing carries influence, especially in emotionally charged situations. She wasn't suggesting manipulation. She was outlining the structure. Then she leaned back. But more importantly, she added, the real leverage here isn't financial. I waited. It's relational, she said. You now hold knowledge they deliberately withheld. That changes the power dynamic, whether you use it or not. That was the private reveal. Not that I had a legal advantage, not that I could destabilize anything, but the axis had shifted. For decades, they had controlled the narrative. They decided when, or if, the truth would surface. They positioned me as the steady son, the reliable one who didn't complicate things. But now, I was the only person in the room who understood the full story. They thought I was still operating on partial information. I wasn't, and that awareness did something unexpected. It didn't make me angry. It made me calm. When you grow up slightly outside the center of a system, you learn to read it carefully. You become attuned to micro-expressions, tonal shifts, and the weight of unspoken words. Now, every family interaction carried new dimension. At dinner one night, my mother mentioned, "We were so lucky when you came into our lives." Came into our lives. The phrase was deliberate. I looked at her, held her gaze just a second longer than usual, and said, "Timing matters, doesn't it?" She smiled, but her eyes searched mine briefly. A flicker. She didn't know what I knew. And that uncertainty now belonged to her, not me. That was the inversion. For years, I had felt subtly off balance, slightly outside. Like everyone else had access to a shared origin story. I was reading from a summary. Now I had the extended edition. I knew about the 9-month gap before finalization. I knew the agency had restructured due to procedural controversies in the early 90s. I knew my biological mother's name. I hadn't contacted her. Not yet. Because this wasn't about replacement. It was about authorship. For the first time, my identity wasn't something passively received. It was something I could define. And here's what they never anticipated. Silence, when chosen consciously, unsettles people more than confrontation. If I had stormed into their house demanding explanations, they would have reacted predictably. Defensiveness, tears, justifications. Instead, I maintained composure, measured, observant, present. And gradually I noticed something subtle. My father began explaining minor details more thoroughly than usual. My mother checked in with me more often. "Are you okay?" asked casually, but slightly too frequently. They sensed a shift. They just didn't know its shape. That's the thing about leverage. You don't have to deploy it. You just have to hold it. And the moment you do, your posture changes. Mine did. Not outwardly. Internally. Because once you understand that your silence is no longer ignorance, but choice, you stop being in the assigned role and start becoming the author. There's a moment after clarity settles in when you realize knowledge alone isn't enough. You have to decide what kind of person you're going to be with it. For weeks after meeting the attorney, I lived in that space. I had options. I could confront my parents directly, lay the documents on the kitchen table, ask them why they chose silence for 34 years. That would be the emotionally satisfying route. It would force transparency. I could contact my biological mother immediately, introduce myself, disrupt two family systems at once, demand a fuller origin story. I could do nothing. Let the information remain private, preserve surface harmony, continue playing my stabilizing role indefinitely. Each option had consequences. Confrontation would give me answers, but it would also shift the emotional weight onto them. It would likely create guilt, defensiveness, maybe even fracture. Reaching out to my biological mother would answer identity questions, but it would also introduce variables I couldn't control. Doing nothing would preserve peace, but at the cost of authenticity. For the first time in my life, the decision wasn't about being useful. It was about being aligned. I took a long walk one evening along the Willamette River. Portland in early spring is quiet. Gray skies, damp air, not many people lingering after sunset. I thought about the word chosen. Adopted children are often told they were chosen. It's meant to feel special, but choice implies selection, and selection implies comparison. I had been chosen, yes, chosen, yes, but I had also been curated. Portions of my origin story were removed for aesthetic stability. The question wasn't whether they loved me. I believe they did, in the way they knew how. The question was whether I was willing to continue participating in a version of myself that required silence about my own beginning. And the answer, slowly, became clear. I wouldn't confront them in anger. I wouldn't accuse. But I would no longer operate inside the edited narrative. That meant one irreversible step. I would reclaim my full legal documentation, every sealed record available under current open adoption access laws. And I would update my own estate planning documents to reflect my complete identity, including my original surname. Not to replace Whitaker, but to integrate what had been withheld. Legally, officially, quietly. This wasn't revenge. It was authorship. The attorney had mentioned that name changes and dual surname acknowledgments were increasingly common in adult adoptees reclaiming heritage. Once processed, those records would exist independently of my parents' narrative. They wouldn't control timing anymore. The irreversible part wasn't paperwork. It was psychological. Once I stepped into full documentation of my origin, I couldn't go back to pretending it didn't matter. And they would eventually notice, not because I'd announce it, but because legal records are updated. Registries sync. Executors' information cross-references. The system that once exposed the omission would quietly register the correction, and when that happened, the silence would no longer be unilateral. It would be shared. I stopped walking and looked out over the river. For most of my life, I had accepted the role given to me. Now I was choosing one. I didn't need confrontation to feel powerful. I needed coherence. So I made the appointment. Petition for unsealing records. Application for amended legal name to include original surname as middle name. Updated personal estate file. No announcement. No drama. Just movement. In silence. Paperwork is rarely cinematic. There are no violins in the background when you sit in a county records office, filling out amendment forms. No dramatic lighting when you initially every page confirming identity verification. Just fluorescent lights, clipboards, quiet signatures. I scheduled everything on weekday mornings. Half days off work. Neutral calendar entries. Personal admin. That's what I labeled them. The petition to unseal non-identifying adoption records was straightforward under current state law. The clerk reviewed my ID, notarized the request, and gave me a receipt with a processing timeline. 6 to 8 weeks, she said. I nodded. Patience again. The name amendment was slightly more involved, not a full surname change. That would have triggered wider family conversations immediately, but an official addition of my original surname as a second middle name. Legally visible, socially optional, integration, not replacement. The judge reviewed the request in a brief virtual hearing. Reason for amendment? He asked. To reflect complete birth identity, I replied evenly. He studied the file for a moment, then nodded. Approved. One word. No applause. But something inside me settled. After that, I updated my personal documents methodically. Driver's license, passport application, bank accounts, retirement beneficiary designations. Each system required verification. Each system synced with state databases. I didn't rush. Quiet dominance isn't about speed. It's about inevitability. Meanwhile, family life continued unchanged on the surface. Sunday dinners, group texts, occasional debates about holiday schedules. If anything, my parents were slightly more attentive lately. My mother would ask, "You've seemed thoughtful recently. Everything all right?" "I've just been organizing some things," I'd say truthfully. Organizing. That word felt almost ironic. One afternoon, about a month into the process, my father called unexpectedly. "Quick question," he said. "Have you updated your contact details recently with the bank?" "Yes," I replied calmly. "Why?" "They mentioned a file cross-reference during a routine review. Just wanted to make sure nothing was off." "Everything's correct," I said. There was a pause. "Good," he answered. He didn't ask more, but something had registered. Systems talk to each other. Financial institutions cross-check identification records. Executors' profiles sync with legal databases. I hadn't made an announcement, but the architecture was shifting. An architecture once altered changes weight distribution. Around that same time, my unsealed non-identifying adoption summary arrived. It didn't include names yet, just background information. Biological mother, 19 at the time of birth. College student. Medical history. Documented family cardiac condition. There it was. Medical history. The form I'd once been told not to overcomplicate. I added the details to my personal health file. Not emotionally. Practically. Each new piece of information didn't create chaos. It created alignment. At dinner one Sunday, Daniel joked about family genetics when discussing his son's eye color. "Guess the Whitaker genes are strong," he laughed. I met his eyes calmly. "Genetics are interesting," I said. "They don't always tell the whole story." He shrugged. The comment floated past everyone else, but my mother's fork paused midair for half a second. She knew something was different. She just didn't know the scale. That's the power of moving in silence. There's no explosion, no confrontation, just quiet recalibration until the old structure begins to feel slightly unfamiliar, even to the people who built it. And soon, that unfamiliarity would demand a conversation, not because I forced it, but because of omission. Once disrupted by the official record, it can't remain invisible forever. The first visible consequence wasn't emotional. It was logistical. About 2 months after my legal amendment was approved, my parents scheduled a meeting with their estate planner. "Routine review," my father said in the family group chat. "As executor, you should attend, Matt." Of course. I arrived at the office 10 minutes early. Same building as before. Same neutral decor. Same careful language. The planner began by reviewing beneficiary designations and identification updates. Then he paused. "There appears to have been a recent update to your legal name, Matthew," he said, glancing between us. Our system automatically flagged the cross-reference. Silence. Not dramatic silence. Measured silence. I spoke first. "Yes?" I said calmly. I added my original surname as a second middle name. The word original hung in the air. My mother blinked slowly. "Oh," she said. The same word she had used in the registry office months earlier. My father cleared his throat. "I see." The planner, unaware of the emotional geometry, continued professionally. "No issue at all. We'll just update documentation to reflect your full legal name to avoid future discrepancies." Avoid discrepancies. Interesting phrasing. The meeting ended without confrontation, but something had shifted permanently. On the drive home, my parents were quieter than usual. Finally, my mother spoke. "You've been doing a lot of organizing lately." "Yes," I replied. "Is there something you'd like to talk about?" There it was. Not an accusation. Invitation. I considered my words carefully. "I believe in having accurate records," I said evenly, "especially when identity is involved." Another pause. My father stared straight ahead at the road. "We always intended to tell you," he said finally. Intended? Future tense applied retroactively. I nodded. "I understand." And I did. Intentions can be sincere and still incomplete. What changed after that wasn't explosive. It was subtle erosion. My mother began checking in more frequently, but her tone carried caution now. Not casual warmth. Assessment. Daniel called one evening, confused. Hey, did something happen at the estate meeting? Mom seemed tense. Nothing dramatic, I said. Are we good? He asked. We're fine. And we were. That was the strange part. I wasn't angry, but they were unsettled, because the narrative had shifted beyond their control. At the next family dinner, I noticed micro adjustments. My father referenced my adoption casually in a story, testing the word in open air for the first time. Back when we adopted Matthew, he stopped mid-sentence. No one reacted loudly, but everyone registered it. Emily looked at me, confused. Adopted? She asked softly. There it was. The ripple. My parents exchanged a glance. It's something we've meant to discuss as a family, my mother said carefully. I held my posture steady, not defensive, not exposed. Present. The consequences weren't about inheritance or legality. They were about destabilized certainty. For decades, they had managed timing. Now timing was neutral, and neutrality makes people uneasy when they're used to control. That evening ended without resolution, but the ground had shifted, not because I confronted, not because I accused, but because official records had begun telling the full story. And once systems acknowledge truth, families eventually have to. The family meeting happened the following Sunday, not because I demanded it, because silence had become heavier than disclosure. We sat in my parents' living room, the same room where holiday photos lined the walls, where my childhood certificates still sat framed in symmetrical rows. This time, the symmetry felt different. My mother began. We should have told you earlier, she said, hands folded tightly in her lap. We always planned to. Planned. That word again. My father nodded. We didn't want you to feel different. I almost smiled at the irony. I did, I said gently. Not accusatory, just factual. The room went still. Emily looked between us, eyes wide. Daniel leaned back, absorbing. You knew? Emily asked. For a while, I replied. How? Daniel said. The registry office. I said, no, in your office, I said calmly, a few months ago. My mother inhaled sharply. Why didn't you say anything? There it was. Not why did we hide it. Why didn't you react? I answered honestly. I needed clarity before the conversation. My father's voice tightened. We were protecting you. From what? I asked quietly. Silence. From complexity? From identity questions? From the truth? My mother's eyes filled with tears. Not dramatic sobbing, just quiet overflow. We loved you, she said. I know, I replied. And I did. Love wasn't the absence. Transparency was. Daniel spoke next, trying to stabilize the moment the way I used to. Okay, but this doesn't change anything, right? You're still our brother. I met his gaze. I've always been your brother, I said. The difference is that now everyone understands the full story. That was the part they hadn't prepared for. They had imagined disclosure as emotional. Tears, reassurance, maybe relief. What they hadn't anticipated was composure. What they hadn't anticipated was that I had already processed it privately. My father leaned forward. Is this about the name change? Yes, I said simply. You added your birth name. I integrated it, I corrected gently. The distinction mattered. My mother shook her head slightly. It feels like you're pulling away. I considered that. I'm standing where I've always been, I said, just without missing information. There was no shouting, no accusations, but something irreversible had occurred. For decades, they had controlled when and how the truth would surface. Now, it had surfaced without their choreography, and they couldn't edit it back. You can apologize for the timing. You can explain the intention, but you can't return someone to unknowing. That's what made it too late to fix, because this wasn't about anger. It was about trust recalibrated. Trust, once rebalanced, doesn't snap back into its original shape. It reforms, slowly. That evening ended with quiet hugs. Real ones, but different. Not because love had disappeared, because illusion had. An illusion, once removed, leaves space that has to be rebuilt intentionally. They thought the crisis was the revelation. It wasn't. The crisis was that I hadn't needed them to reveal it. That part unsettled them most. A few days after the family meeting, my father asked me to come by alone. Just you, he said over the phone. We should talk. I arrived in the early evening. The house felt the same. Familiar furniture, familiar scent of brewed coffee, but the emotional climate had shifted. We sat across from each other at the dining table. No audience, no siblings buffering the space. My father folded his hands. I owe you more than what we said on Sunday, he began. I didn't interrupt. When we adopted you, he continued, choosing his words carefully, the agency advised discretion. They believed it would help with bonding if the child felt fully integrated. No distinctions. Integrated, I repeated softly. Yes. My mother joined us halfway through, sitting beside him. We were afraid, she admitted. Afraid that if you felt different, you'd pull away, or look for someone else. I considered that. You understand the irony, I said calmly. She blinked. You withheld information to prevent distance, I continued, but the withholding created distance anyway. There was no accusation in my tone, just structure. My father nodded slowly. We see that now. I believed him. The conversation moved carefully, almost academically. I asked practical questions. Did you ever intend to tell me at a specific age? We discussed 18, my mother said. Then college felt overwhelming. Then it just became harder. Harder. Time doesn't just pass, it compounds. I asked about my biological mother. They knew little. The adoption had been closed, minimal background provided, no ongoing contact. We thought we were giving you a clean start, my father said. A clean start, I echoed. That phrase carried weight. Clean can also mean erased, but I didn't say that aloud. Instead, I asked the question that mattered most. Did you ever see me as less yours? Both of them answered immediately. No. The speed of their response was instinctive, not rehearsed. I believed that too. Love had been real, but so had control. And those two things can coexist in complicated ways. I'm not angry, I told them. My mother exhaled shakily. You seem steady. I am, I said. That steadiness unsettled them more than rage would have. Because rage can be soothed. Steadiness has to be respected. I've unsealed my records, I added. They exchanged a glance. We know, my father said quietly. The planner mentioned additional identity verification. Good, I replied. I didn't want you to hear it from someone else. That was the closest I came to confrontation. Not heat, not blame, just transparency where there had once been omission. Before I left, my mother reached for my hand. We never meant to hurt you. I know, I said again. Intent matters, but so does impact. Walking out of that house, I didn't feel victorious. I felt level. For the first time in my life, I wasn't adjusting myself to maintain comfort. I was standing in full context, and they were meeting me there. That's what confrontation without heat looks like. Not domination. Alignment. Identity doesn't shatter the way movies suggest. It doesn't explode into fragments. It reorders. Over the months that followed, nothing dramatic happened. No family estrangements, no dramatic reconciliations, just gradual recalibration. My updated legal name began appearing in formal correspondence. Matthew Hale Whitaker, birth surname. At first, seeing the additional name felt foreign, like wearing a jacket that fits but hasn't been broken in yet. Then it began to feel accurate. Not rebellious, not symbolic, accurate. I eventually requested identifying information through the appropriate legal channels and made a careful, written first contact with my biological mother. Not an emotional letter, not accusatory, just respectful acknowledgement of existence. Whether that relationship deepens or remains minimal isn't the point. The point is choice. For most of my life, my origin story had been curated on my behalf. Now, I was participating in it consciously. At family dinners, conversations shifted subtly. Adoption was no longer a hidden subtext. It became part of the open narrative. Emily asked thoughtful questions. Daniel apologized once, awkwardly, for never noticing the imbalance. You were always just Matt. Matt, he said. I still am, I replied. But I'm also more. My parents made an effort to include details they once would have smoothed over. My medical history file was updated openly. Old documents were reviewed together instead of being archived quietly. Trust doesn't regenerate overnight, but transparency builds differently than secrecy. I also changed in smaller, less visible ways. I stopped volunteering for every stabilizing role. If conflict arose between my siblings, I let it exist without absorbing it. If my parents needed administrative help, I offered it, but not automatically. Being adopted didn't make me weaker. It clarified that I had been compensating for something unspoken. Now I don't compensate. I participate. There's a quiet strength in understanding your full story, even when it's imperfect, especially when it's imperfect. I used to think my steadiness came from personality. Now I know it also came from adaptation. A child who senses difference often becomes hyper-aware, hyper-capable, hyper-reliable. It's a survival strategy. But adulthood allows refinement. Today, I'm still calm, still analytical, still the man who carries a black leather notebook everywhere. But I'm not invisible, not to myself. And that's the key difference. My relationship with my parents isn't fractured. It's more honest. They no longer manage timing. I no longer manage comfort. We meet in the middle. And if there's any quiet dominance in my story, it isn't about power over them. It's about power over my own narrative. For the first time, my identity isn't something handed to me. It's something I hold fully. Integrated. Unedited. Complete. If you've listened this far, you might be expecting a dramatic ending. A final confrontation. A permanent rupture. A clear villain. But real life rarely gives you that kind of symmetry. What it gives you is information. and then it waits to see what you'll do with it. The day I learned I was adopted, after seeing my name missing from the family registry, didn't destroy my family. It revealed its architecture. No one planned to tell me, not because they didn't love me, but because love, when mixed with fear, sometimes chooses control over honesty. For years, I was the steady one, the reliable one, the son who didn't complicate things. What I've learned is this: silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes it's processing, sometimes it's positioning. But silence without truth slowly erodes trust, even in stable families. The quiet dominance in my story wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about reclaiming authorship. I didn't need to expose anyone. I didn't need to punish anyone. I needed to integrate what had been omitted. There's a difference between being chosen and being fully informed. Both can coexist, but only one builds lasting trust. Today, when I look at my full legal name, when I see both surnames on official documents, I don't feel divided. I feel complete, not because everything was handled perfectly, but because I chose not to let secrecy define me. If you've ever discovered something about your identity later than you should have, if you've ever realized your role in a family was shaped by information you didn't have, here's the question I'll leave you with. When the truth finally surfaces, do you use it to create distance or to create alignment? I'd really like to hear your perspective. Because sometimes the most powerful move isn't loud. It's simply deciding who you are, with the full story in your hands.